On this week's episode, we're going to analyze... Nah, I'm just kidding. We're going to rip the industry a new one again. I gotta confess something. This episode was supposed to be a nice and easy listicle episode about games I thought could use a good old-fashioned reboot. Yes, I know that's lazy, but I went out of town and thought it wouldn't hurt. Then Square Enix went and Square Enixed again. If you didn't know, there's a new Deus Ex game coming out this month, Mankind Divided. Yes, really this month. You probably didn't notice since there's this other big title coming out too. Anyway, the news around Mankind Divided right now isn't about something within the game that you would normally expect to be one of these outrages, you know, like a graphical problem or creative choice. Instead, this is about the ad campaign. You see, the hook of Mankind Divided is the carryover from the previous game regarding the tensions between regular humans and augmented humans. Mankind Divided's framing is based on these tensions reaching extremes that cause the issues that the main character is actually responding to. And yes, there's a reason I explained it that way, hang on. Now that you know the setup, here's where the ad campaign comes in. Like most AAA games, Mankind Divided's marketing has been more about generating buzz than actually showing off the game, which has led to some pretty eye-raising situations this time around. The first eyes went up a few weeks ago when a live-action trailer showed up called The Mechanical Apartheid, which itself was a pretty decent video. I even mentioned it positively on an episode of Three Good Sirs. However, the title and subject was clearly intended to invoke similarities to apartheid that occurred in South Africa for literally decades. It was a little cringy with that context, but it's not unfamiliar for science fiction to lean on historical allusion, so it mostly flew under the radar. Fast forward to a few days ago when new promotional art showed up with the depiction of a protest line and a heavily armed police force, and even had a nice sign to show what this was mimicking, in case you couldn't tell. Yeah, it definitely looks a lot like the Black Lives Matter protests being seen in the United States, and I understand is happening abroad now? And these have been hot-button issues. This caught quite a bit more fire, mostly due to the fact that Black Lives Matter is a recent response to an ongoing issue, whereas the previous eye-raiser was at least something of the past. And... okay, look. This one is quite a bit to unpack. For what it's worth, there's no point in me trying to break down or convince anyone of the motives or purpose of Black Lives Matter, let alone the massive historical implications of apartheid. Most of that's due to the fact that I'm a white guy and I'd much rather be an ally than let more qualified voices speak to such things. There are enough white people that try to force their voices to be louder. If you're curious to learn more about Black Lives Matter and or the struggles of Black Americans, I'm going to drop a couple of videos I think handle such things much better than I can at the end of the video. And please, let's try to keep things civil around the comments too. Great. Anyway, plain and simple. I'm not the best voice for specific details of Black issues, but I do know a thing or two about video game advertising. So, I've often said before that how a video game, or any media for that matter, is advertised to you is a reflection of how the producers of that content actually views its audience. And while I didn't think I'd get a great example of this so soon, Deus Ex's marketing is such a grand example of how this works. Things were off from the beginning of this whole thing. Square Enix intended to announce the game with a 3-day Twitch stream set to end with the reveal of the game. That got disrupted when the pre-order materials started showing up early and word of the game started to leak out. They decided to go forward with the stream, which was called Can't Kill Progress, and it turned out to be a 3-day stream of a guy sitting in a room. Twitch chat could change the camera angle, and every so often the guy would get beat up by a couple of nondescript guards, but that was it. Seriously, Square Enix was allowed to do literally nothing on Twitch and not get banned. I know, bullcrap, right? Naturally, people got bored really quick, and it didn't take long for a foreign retailer's pre-order page to be found, along with all the info and screens of the game. It was at that point that Square Enix decided to actually pull the trigger on announcing this game, but that only ended up running into the next disaster, which would be the Augment Your Pre-Order campaign. The basis of Augment Your Pre-Order was to, in short, help push pre-ordering by unlocking bonus content and product as the number of pre-orders rose. The catch to this, however, was that not every single unlock was available. Instead, customers were expected to choose which bonuses they would actually receive from each tier. Yes, really. Now, if you're thinking, wait, doesn't that just mean that people were really choosing which bonuses they wouldn't be getting, which actually made it impossible to have the complete game? Well, you would be right, and luckily, the customers agree with you. Pre-orders basically stopped in response to this, and backlash got so bad that within a couple of weeks, the entire promotion was canned in favor of a straightforward pre-order deal. Though maybe we shouldn't be pre-ordering games, huh? With 2 botched promotion attempts under their belt, the promotional team from Mankind Divided went almost completely dark for a few months, with information about the game being kept close to the chest, and the only news being more brand-related as opposed to being specifically about this game. The game didn't even have a big showing at E3 outside of a demonstration for the press, and that got overshadowed by pretty much everything from that show. Which brings us back to Mechanical Apartheid and Aug Lives Matter. How did we get those out of Can't Kill Progress and Augment Your Pre-Order? If I had to guess, I would say it was because the targets of the marketing changed. The previous 2 campaigns were basically weapons-grade industry nonsense, not unlike other marketing schemes and business models from other publishers. But that's also the problem. Everyone is already sick of that nonsense. We'd already lived through the Watch Dogs 15 different editions debacle, for crying out loud. Consumers are getting wiser and wiser to these tricks, and they're not willing to put up with them. That being said, the normal AAA audience is still pretty reliable sales-wise. Easing off the gas on trying to secure that money isn't going to lose that money, and plenty of fans will still buy the game at launch, I'm sure. However, marketers do pay attention to social trends, and they've found a new way to get that ever-coveted millennial dollar. As we've talked about before, games are becoming more and more socially conscious and aware. This is in response to a growing audience that is moving in the same direction, and it seems pretty clear that someone on the marketing team for this game is paying attention to this. The marketing is now leaning heavily on the framing story of Mankind Divided, and using it to invoke familiarity to social issues, both ongoing and historical. And on the surface, this might not seem so bad. I said it myself earlier in this video. Science fiction stories often use the historical reference to frame their stories, to highlight social issues and put black eyes on humanity's less favorable history. Except that's not what's being done here. Mankind Divided so far hasn't, and likely won't, have anything to actually say about any of these issues. How do I know? Because they've told us so. The game that was announced with Can't Kill Progress is still being marketed with Mechanical Apartheid. While games do change during development, the game hasn't been delayed to be completely remade or rewritten, which means that the parts of the game that they've shown off will be, at least at its core, the same as it was always intended to be. That's not just me blabbling either. The game's own brand director said so, even though there's no way that's a coincidence and he's obviously talking nonsense. As nice as it is to get a bold AAA game willing to actually stand for something, or at least take these issues seriously, Mankind Divided is not going to be that game. So what happened to create this situation? Square Enix, duh. The past few years for Square Enix have been pretty back and forth as a company. It's not a secret that the company considers many of its releases over the past few years failures, mostly due to the bloated nature of AAA game development. Consider several of the sporadic changes made to very recent titles. Just Cause 3 launched in a state that many found to be lacking, and sources say that the single-player mode of the game was haphazardly added in very late in the development. The newest Hitman started as a full retail title and was even announced that way before it ended up being released episodically. And that's before you even consider the differences between the Western and Eastern mindsets that make the company seem like it's 2 entirely different companies. Like charging massive amounts of money for ports of old games in markets that competition can completely undercut, like the mobile industry. Bravely Second being barely marketed in the mainstream, even though the sales of Bravely Default in that market were supposed to change Square Enix's mind about the viability of JRPGs. Or releasing 2 freaking sequels to objectively the worst Final Fantasy game ever. Oh, and speaking of Final Fantasy, they released All the Bravest, which ought to be a punishable crime around the world. It's not really just Square Enix, though I obviously love giving them grief. It's the game industry. Once again, this is more marketing bull. Just this time it's trying to exploit our heartstrings instead of our hype meters. There's nothing wrong with being socially conscious, in fact more people should be, and there's nothing wrong with being excited for a game's release either. However, the industry too often exploits these things to try to generate more revenue and pre-orders and buzz and loyalty. Chances are, this isn't going to be the only game that is going to be coming that decides to try to lure in purchases by throwing a bunch of deep issues at the screen. Racism, sexism, class warfare, military states, propaganda, think about things! But none of that will be genuine either, more than likely. And really, that's just sad. Imagine if we did get a game that was like those movies that win Oscars because they're willing to go to tough places and talk about tough issues directly, instead of dance around them as framing devices to lure players in. For example, what if Assassin's Creed 3 actually talked about the less savory things in the American Revolution, instead of just staring at the camera and leaving it to the player to catch on? I mean, come on, Hamilton was able to do that. Maybe I'm just asking too much for games to, I don't know, maybe treat its audience like people. Go ahead and buy Deus Ex Mankind Divided if you think it looks cool or has an interesting premise or because you're a fan of the series. But don't buy it because you think it's trying to say something. It definitely is not. Sure would be nice to know that they're not going to mess up Final Fantasy 15. Oh, for the love of RCS! Seriously though, Square Enix, are we ever actually going to get Kingdom Hearts 3? I have actually asked people who are going to be involved in this game if we're going to get a Kingdom Hearts 3, and guess what? It's not happening. No one has any idea. What's up with that?
Is it selfish to want to matter? Is it selfish to want to matter? Like, in the grand scheme of things, I really don't. I could be gone tomorrow. And if I'm gone even in 100 years from now, that's just like it's a snap in like the plane of just human existence. I've been more aware of death lately.
In no way am I saying that every officer on the police force abuses their power. I have met some very, very kind-hearted police officers. And for those officers that do their jobs the right way, protecting our communities and not instilling fear in them, thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for the work that you put in. Thank you for putting your life on the line every single time that you put on that badge. But unfortunately, as we all should know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
We have serious issues that must be resolved. In many cities and towns across the nation, there's a deep divide between the black community and law enforcement, a trust gap